BIA Kelsey Live. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe, and those are our terrible intro sounds. I'm joined today by Mike Boland, our chief analyst. He's in San Francisco. I'm near Seattle. Welcome to our discussion, our weekly discussion of local media and marketing. Today we're going to be talking about several things. First off, we just released the new BIA Kelsey mobile ad revenue forecast for the next 5 years. Mike will be walking us through the findings there. We're also going to talk about voice assistants, the Google Home, the Amazon Echo, and how we believe small business may be able to start to leverage use of these tools, certainly brands as well, and by training customers to use the old-fashioned ad slogan. We'll talk more about that. And finally, we're going to look at what I would describe now as the leasing economy, the sharing economy, that is, equipment and other kinds of hard capital goods being loaned on demand. And we'll be talking particularly about Equipment Share, a new company, or actually a company that just raised another $26 million to share heavy industrial equipment. So, Mike, the mobile ad revenue report, it's projecting a doubling of mobile over the next 5 years. Tell us about what you found.
Sure. So the background here is that this report branches from the biannual local media ad forecast, which covers all kinds of media, television, print, and mobile's one component of that. And we released that overall report a few months ago. So this was an opportunity to say, look, mobile is very impactful, obviously. We're going to give it its own treatment in a standalone drill-down narrative report. So the numbers mirror a lot of what we already announced, but this really just goes into depth on the stories behind the numbers. So as a reminder, that overall local forecast we released pegs local media ad spending at about 148 billion in 2017. So the mobile portion of that is about 12 billion in 2016, growing to 32 billion in 2021, which is a 21% compound annual growth rate. Now, the drivers at a high level for that include mobile users' commercial intent. It tends to skew higher on the mobile device than it does on the desktop. I think that's a familiar story. But what's happening is advertisers are evolving more to align with that behavior. There's also premiums associated with mobile location-targeted ads when they're done right, and that's a function of the kind of higher performance that they can get if done right, and then growing demand. It just tends to raise things like bid pressure, which controls things like CPCs. And again, Madison Avenue is kind of latching on to these realities in their ad strategies and their ad kind of budget shifts. But it's interesting, they're not moving as fast as they should, in my opinion. And one of the things we say in the report is that the smartphone revolution turns 10 this year. 2007, right. The launch of the iPhone 1, which really kind of, was an inflection point for where we are now.
Absolutely.
But many are still far behind and operating in that kind of desktop mindset. And I think that those folks will be left behind the next era of mobile, which is changing yet again and skewing towards these things such as native social, which I'll explain in a minute, and voice interfaces, as we're going to go over next, as opposed to things like banner ads and traditional search and things that are largely a holdover of the desktop era and desktop ad tactics.
Right.
And on that note, one of the biggest kind of takeaways isn't just the overall kind of growth of mobile and the things I just went over, but the share shifts we're seeing between, within the mobile spend, between different formats, which
right.
reflects lots of kind of interesting usage trends and advertiser adoption. And when I say format, what I mean is, the many ways that mobile content is consumed and correspondingly the packaging of ad units that are delivered through those channels. So we're talking like search and display and messaging and video and native social, which I alluded to earlier. And the real headline in closing, and then I'll let you jump in, is that, search has long ruled. And that's, again, a vestige of the desktop. But it's slowly losing share to emerging formats like native social. And that has a lot to do with mobile user behavior that shies away from web and browser-based experiences on the mobile device in favor of apps. So search is kind of suffering from that. And that's something we've talked about before. But I'll let you jump in. I want to define native social at some point.
Yeah, sure.
I'll let you jump
in
first.
Let me ask you something about you talked about desktop behavior and the fact that the agencies are still primarily oriented around that, and that's primarily interruptive.
Yeah.
We're going to put a message in or around something that we're conveying to you as a valuable story. but we're going to stop you to do it.
Yeah.
How do you see that changing, and how do apps need to integrate calls to action in such a way that it doesn't interrupt people?
Yeah.
Instead, it feels like the flow of the discovery and relationship is evolving rather than just, let's look at an ad now.
Yeah. So I think that gets into native social. And that tees me up nicely.
I may have been teeing you up there, Mike.
Yeah. But what you're talking about, I think, is endemic to what we're calling traditional display. So that's right. Banner ads that are shown on the top and bottom, sometimes other places within mobile apps, and they're proven to be largely ineffective for a lot of reasons, because they're interruptive, as you said. Millennials tend to shy away from that form of more kind of didactic advertising. They don't like to be told what to do and what to think. So kind of with all of that, one format that has started to rise and be more effective is what we're calling native social. And that is essentially what you probably know of as like Facebook newsfeed ads, or on Instagram or Snapchat, or things that are kind of brand stories that integrate with the content. And not in a disingenuous way like advertorial that you see sometimes in publications. Not in that way, but in ways that, a brand, for example, instead of taking their 30-second spot from television and like shoving it on a pre-roll before some sort of mobile experience, what they're doing is they're using something like Instagram and creating photos on Instagram for their followers to see, and then they can pay for that to be kind of broadcasted beyond their own followers. So it's actually utilizing the exact format that is the kind of core element of whatever the experience is. On Instagram, it's pictures. On Facebook, it's lots of multimedia and like status updates. But it's utilizing those same exact formats, but telling a story. And that tends to alleviate some of the interruptive point that you mentioned. And also it's resonating with millennials who like things that are genuine, or like kind of brand experiences, or things that are a narrative, as opposed to a traditional banner ad. Hey, buy this.
Well, and I saw some early research on Gen Z this week, the teenagers who are following millennials, and they are even more pronouncedly dedicated to brands with meaning. The major difference I saw in the data was that they have a greater sense that they're going to have to earn their own way in the world. And so I think that calls for brands to be allies of those consumers. And again, that makes the story even more important.
Yeah, it's about telling a story. And the other advantages to native social is more practical, is that they have inventory advantages. When you're talking about a vertically scrolling feed, which is most of the kind of apps we're talking about here, mobile screens obviously lack real estate for traditional kind of top and side banner ads that again rule the desktop web and are in a lot of apps. But a vertically scrolling feed like you see in Facebook, like you see in Instagram and many others, holds greater capacity for ad inventory and session time. So I think from an inventory perspective, it also has a lot of advantages. So, there's a lot more we go into in the report besides just native social. We look at all of these different formats and the drivers and the outlook for each one, which I think is important, because anyone playing in the mobile advertising game should need to know, where these trends are going, and, skate where the puck is going, so to speak, and see these important trends of where they place their chips for if you're a publisher in terms of the type of inventory you want to build, if you're an advertiser on the buy side, the types of ad budget shifting you should be planning for in the near and far term, all that good stuff. So there's a lot there for that.
Well, so, folks, if you want to check this out, there's an article at blog.biakelsey.com talking about that. It's at the top of the page right now. But we also are going to talk about that lower cost or lower effectiveness inventory in this next story. And so what I did this week was look at some research from Voice Labs, a new company, or a new research company, and really an app development company for the voice assistant market. And they found some very interesting things. But first, a little market background. About 7 million Google Homes and Amazon Echoes and other voice response devices have been purchased over the last year in the United States. And Voice Labs is projecting that 25 million more are going to be purchased this year. So we're talking about, roughly 32 to 35 million households that have some form of listening device in the house. And these voice assistants have a rapidly expanding range of capabilities. They call them skills, but we can think of those as apps for these phones. The interface, though, is a command. And you have to be very specific in order to have a particular skill function correctly. You have to make the right request. You have to say, Alexa, order me pizza, but specifically from Pizza Hut or from Domino's, rather than order me pizza, which would invoke a search. If you're going to build a skill, you want the customer to be asking specifically for your skill in these environments. And the challenge is that only 3% of these skills, when used, are used by the same consumers a week later. So you've got this real churn problem with these skills. And I think that the question for small and medium-sized business, as well as brands seeking to have people use an Amazon or a Google Home command, is to use a lot of other inventory to reinforce the use of the phrase, the trigger phrase for their skills. It's something that we haven't seen for a long time, but if anybody living in the United States doesn't have a refrigerator magnet reminding them who their plumber is, for instance, I think that's the kind of example of little cues that we can use: direct mail, email, low-cost digital display advertising to target people, to constantly remind them that there's a certain phrase to trigger a function in an app. And that's something we can do at a very local level. You could, as a small business, target only the people within 10 miles of your business and have them, repeatedly say an ad that says, "Got plumbing problems? Tell Alexa, call Bob Smith about my plumbing." And that could be the entire skill, is to make that connection and make that appointment, which is, of course, the treasured engagement everybody wants in local. And so I'd love to hear what you're thinking about the evolution of voice assistants as an advertising medium, since, of course, they don't really advertise. They simply wait for us to tell them what we need. Yep. How does that change this marketing problem?
A lot, and I wanna get to your point about kind of training users to use certain kind of phraseology to kind of the wake word and the keywords. But backing up, I think this is interesting. So Voice Labs, I think they said that last year, 7
million.
Yeah, 7 million voice search, voice first kind of assistance devices. So that's Google Home, it's Amazon Alexa, it's mostly Alexa at this point. And then next year, or I'm sorry, this year, 2017, it's going to be up to 25 million. I think that's very supportive of the prediction we've made, which is that voice search, last year, Google reported it was 20% of overall queries. We've predicted it's going to be up to 25 this year. I think it's supportive. But also I'm kind of torn there with, I'm thinking some of it involves a bit of kind of overexcitement, as you often see with kind of new technologies.
Absolutely.
And I think there's going to be a trough of disillusionment when the technology falls down in certain situations. The app fatigue thing you mentioned comes into that. But I think also we're going to need to see some sort of combination of voice and a screen interface, whether that be syncing with your smartphone or other screen-based devices. I think a lot of the use cases we see kind of proposed, even in like Amazon commercials, are things like, your hands are all messy and, Amazon, what's the recipe for this thing I'm making? And it's interesting. Things like that, if you think about it, aren't conducive to a voice response. You'd have to keep asking her over and over again, how many tomatoes? So something that is more screen-based, I don't know if that's resident in the machine or pairing with your smartphone. I think it's going to have to, the use case still hasn't been solidified. It's still very exciting. We still stand by our prediction, but there's the app fatigue challenge you mentioned, which I think is important. There's the fragmentation between different platforms, making that even worse. You got Google, Amazon, all of the different.
So just to add a little bit to the complexity of that, okay, so Alexa has 7,000 skills now.
Yeah.
And we don't actually use more than 6,000 words in normal conversation.
It's
so
just
we're
like
actually
the
already
app fatigue problem, where there are just too many of them. I think it's going to be less evident because, explicit apps fill up screen real estate, and you can say wow, I got so many, I got to start erasing these. The Amazon skills will be like in the background, but they will still kind of like lie fallow and neglected, which is your point. And it's just going to be like the app easy come easy go problem. People download a bunch and then never use them.
Well, and the IoT challenge that you're describing of bringing it up on a screen or another device in the house so that there's an ability to refer to it
Yeah.
visually is critically important, and that's
In
something that we're
some
continuing to
searches,
weave together.
yeah, some searches will be conducive to hearing an answer. Some will you have to read it because of the level of complexity, or you're gonna have to ask her to repeat it like 30 times.
Well, or
Um,
you might want it to pass it a map to your phone
there
because
you
you
go.
asked at home, but now you're going to go. So there's cross-device experience
Yeah,
becomes essential to this.
and they're assumably angling towards that because that creates an ecosystem play for them with higher lock-in and retention and own all our devices because they work well together. Google's
Right.
clearly going for that play with Home and Android,
Yep.
Pixel, and all of that. And Apple's always done that strategy. But anyway, I want to get to your point about the kind of training customers
Right.
to, I'm actually torn on this. I agree with you in a lot of ways that utilizing the marketing you're already doing to basically communicate this new way of speaking or new way of like triggering a search in the case of having voice personal assistance. I think that's important, and it's kind of the new version of like advertising your AOL keyword or your
Yeah,
Twitter
in a way it
handle,
is.
your
Yeah.
Twitter handle, or even your website. It becomes tagged on to any marketing message. This is where you find us. I think that's going to happen, but only to a certain degree, because I think there are two challenges there. One, the platform fragmentation. You're not going to have enough room in your ad copy to say, here's our Amazon, the way to get us on Alexa. Here's the way to get us on
Right.
Google Home. And so I think
Well,
there's
or
going to
one phrase has to be used
yeah,
across all those.
consistently. So also, I'm also somewhat skeptical, and this is just more of like a 40,000 foot view. Whenever it comes to training people to talk in a certain way, and I think that goes back to when we saw SEO evolve considerably from the desktop to the mobile device because a certain behavior developed. Keywords got longer in length, or I'm sorry, search phrases had more
Yeah.
words. The colloquialisms got different. The way of asking questions got different. And then SEO had to evolve with that in terms of anticipating the way that people speak and then buying keywords and setting up websites and keywords and all that accordingly. So it's more of a reactive thing. I agree that your kind of proactive approach and getting people to say things is part of it, but it also is going to require a reactive kind of evolution on the part of the SEO world. Yet again, just like the transition from desktop to mobile, the transition
Right.
from mobile and desktop to voice search is going to be more natural language. It's not going to be, pizza San Francisco. It's going to be Alexa, order me a thin crust pizza with, extra cheese. And, so the natural language query is going to be different, which in turn requires the SEO strategies to once again completely shift.
Right. And so there's a couple of other things to think about. That trigger could be something that you have already programmed the response to. So you don't
Yep.
necessarily have to say the kind of pizza, but what you want to do
True.
is trigger the pizza order.
Yeah.
And so again, it comes back to really simple sloganeering, I
Yeah.
believe.
I agree with that.
Hey, Culligan Man could be the start of the Alexa or Google Home command to get purified water.
Yeah.
And I can see a kind of renaissance of sloganeering
Yeah.
that comes out of this, because the difference between this channel and all the other channels is that they push towards you. This one is waiting for you to set your demand,
Yeah.
and then it will respond. And the trick for the marketer is to have people specify their solution to whatever need they have. And that comes back again to easy to remember phrases, things that when your hands are dirty, you'll go, I really want the help with the Comet Cleanser.
Yeah.
And not that there's going to be a man with Comet Cleanser there squirting it out for you. But those kinds of simple slogans, I believe, will be easy to reinforce with low-cost inventory that's aimed at your audience as well. So ultimately, you might have somebody simply talking to you whenever they need you, and that's a different relationship than we've had with the customer for a long time.
Yeah, and one quick point of clarification, the lesson here isn't necessarily for small businesses. It's for the vendors and the publishers
Everybody.
and those that are
Brands.
trying to get the small businesses business to differentiate with a better strategy, because there are going to be very few SMBs that actually do this on their own. It's mostly going
Right.
to be a service provided to them just like any other advertising service. So the local vendors, the local publishers, anyone selling advertising into the SMB space, the ones that are more kind of advanced in being able to do all these things we're talking about are going to gain
Right.
the edge. And that's why this
I-
inflection point is
yes.
an opportunity for differentiation in that kind of local world.
and an opportunity to think about repackaging some of the other inventory they struggle to sell now in support of this new form of engagement.
Totally.
Yeah. So the last section last story we want to talk about this week comes from the on-demand space, and it's reflective of a variety of moves that I've seen recently tracking the industry. Equipment Share raised a Series A round of $26 million. Excuse me. They raised an A round last year, but they raised another $26 million this year, essentially to track using IoT heavy construction equipment, backhoes, large tractors, and trucks. And the investors came into this because they had upped their game in terms of understanding the logistics of where all this inventory was. And as a result, they're pretty bullish on it. But I think this is reflective not just of the ability to take a big capital expense like construction hardware and lease it out as needed on an on-demand basis. It's also, we're seeing this in last week, Cadillac, or 2 weeks ago, Cadillac introduced a service where for $1,500 a month, you just drive a Cadillac. If you want a new Cadillac, they bring it to you. If you want to keep a car during the winter and a different car during the summer, you just trade your car around. The insurance is covered, the maintenance is covered. It's easy and simple to use if you've got $1,500 and you want to drive a Cadillac. But I believe we're going to see more and more of this kind of structure to acquiring what used to be capital investments, either for a business or for a home, like buying a car. I don't know whether we'll be driven around all the time in Ubers and Lyfts, but we may have cars that we trade out because, one weekend we're going skiing and another weekend we want a convertible because we're going to the desert. Yep. And there's a variety of ways this will play out. Another example of this is Microsoft, in order to sell its Surface devices, has introduced a lease program that, essentially you can lease it, give it back anytime you want, and upgrade whenever you reach a certain point in your lease period to the next version of the product. So essentially, you're never out of date with this Surface product. The interesting thing is when you add up all the costs, it's less than going to Best Buy to buy.
Yeah, interesting.
And as a result of that, and there's a lease processing company in the middle of that relationship that still is making money and not raising the price above the retail price. So there's something very profound going on with the way we think about hardware. As you think about the tearing the world apart, we're digitizing everything and putting new combinations of it back together. How do you foresee your consumption of stuff that we used to buy for large upfront prices evolving over time? I'm curious more for your perspective because I know you've been thinking about this for a long time.
Well, sure. From an anecdotal perspective, I find myself more and more in a mindset of the kind of fundamentals of the on-demand economy, and especially the millennial consumers of that segment, in terms of kind of on-demand use instead of ownership. I actually just went through kind of a crossroads with my car, excuse the pun, with the fact that it actually requires a timing belt. It's going to be about $1,200, and I was thinking, should I just get rid of my car? A year ago, I never would have thought that, but I find myself Ubering everywhere. But yeah, more and more I'm finding myself faced with that decision and opting towards more of a kind of on-demand, kind of short-term rental lease, whatever you want to call it. But it's interesting, too, with this equipment share story that kind of incited all of this. I think we're going to see that fundamental on-demand model take over more and more verticals, and this is something we've been saying for a while. And I think it's interesting. Yeah. It carries the fundamentals of the on-demand economy in lots of ways, one being to kind of rent rather than own, but also from the perspective of the owner, if you're going to buy something, to be able to make extra money by renting it out in a very logistically sound way that is tracked by sensors, and it works towards the yield optimization of physical assets, just like Uber's system works towards the yield optimization of the driver's time. So that's one of the levels it works on. The other level is that, the rental world with like heavy machinery and the B2B stuff already existed. This just brings it to that next level of kind of logistical sophistication of being able to... Go ahead.
That's the transformation that we are undergoing, is a logistical one, not a job and ownership one. It's the product of a logistical evolution.
Yeah. And part of this and what Equipment Share does, which is interesting, just like when your Uber driver's coming, the owner can know when they have their stuff rented out, all kinds of analytics, where it is, when it's turned on, and I think that takes away some of the reticence sometimes to rent out something that is a high value product because you're putting it in the hands of something that is uncertain. That's similar to why people don't rent out their car, but this kind of better analytics, better logistics might start to alleviate some of that reticence from the part of the owner of that equipment to kind of make some money on the side and have your assets work for you in renting them out in some way.
Well, and so the car is generally used by its owner by about 4% of the time.
Yeah, yeah.
If you could, and we know this is what Uber does, is let you utilize your car more as a driver.
Yeah.
As an owner of any capital equipment, you could utilize it more, and you are making money automatically because you have gotten more out of your initial investment. And so, just improving with IoT, the allocation of those resources to clients is a huge upside in terms of profitability.
Yeah.
But then how do you market it and make that all happen conveniently becomes the key marketing and customer engagement question.
Yeah, and that stat reminds me of that kind of statistic that was invoked in kind of the early days of the on-demand movement, which is the average power drill is used 13 minutes total in its entire life. So why are you going out and spending $150 at Home Depot for a power drill for like one project, and then it's going to sit, gathering dust in your closet for 3 years?
Well, and that requires somebody in the neighborhood to have a good closet that everybody can get to.
Exactly.
Yeah. And again, I think we're in the midst of reorganizing all that, and I believe some people will find that their new jobs are simply taking care of everything in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
Which is a strange and sort of 1850s kind of thing. In terms of a lifestyle, but we seem to be headed back more towards the house as the economic unit rather than the community.
Yeah.
So very interesting times. Well, that's it for this week. Everybody remember that we will be back next week, Thursday morning, and we also, of course, broadcast or put this out as a video. You can watch for it on blog.biakelsey.com. That is Mike Bull, and I'm Mitch Ratcliffe, and this has been BIA Kelsey Live. Thanks, everybody.